So it looks like Nvidia is going to bring back the 4080 12GB model that they basically canceled very recently. Now, it's not exactly what you think, and it is also exactly what you think. It's going to be the same GPU. What's going to change? We're thinking two major things here. The price is going to change. I'm going to tell you what I think it is, and it's going to be pretty easy to figure out, I think. Also, the name is definitely going to change. Look at the leaker here. 4070 Ti. Now, they have Ti models all the way back going a few generations, so this is nothing new, and maybe they already had the specs for 4070 and exactly what they wanted to do with that, and they didn't want to sort of get this out the way. So very interesting. A few weeks ago, if you guys remember, they canceled the 4080 12GB. It no longer made sense. And of course, AMD announcing RDNA 3, the 7900 XT coming in at $899, the exact same price that the 4080 12GB was going to be, certainly didn't help matters at all. That GPU is going to absolutely destroy this GPU. After all, AMD has said it themselves that they're targeting the 4080. They're not going for the 4090. The 4090 is in its own sort of category. It's much more expensive. It's much faster. But the 4080 is going to be fair game for the 7900 XT, and the weaker 12GB model never really fared a chance. So that's going to be very, very interesting. Now, 4070 Ti. What's this going to mean? I mean, 12GB of VRAM, and from some of the numbers that we've seen, remember, these were just like speculation and numbers from Nvidia, basically comparing it to the other GPUs. The 4080 12GB was significantly slower than the 4080 16GB. They are not the same class of GPUs. This generation, we're seeing a much bigger gap between sort of the different models. If you guys remember 3090, 3080, 3080 Ti, there wasn't that much between them. Of course, each subsequent model was faster as the price would have to justify it, but difference really wasn't that great. In gaming, a 3080 wasn't that big of a difference from a 3080 Ti, nor was it a big difference from a 3090. Was the difference there? Sure. I mean, the VRAM difference was never really utilized in many games. Now, the difference is much more pronounced. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor. Priced pretty good is a Windows CD key. Today's video sponsor is going to be VIP-CDKdeals.com. Very simple process. You can get a Windows 10 Pro CD key and remember to use code CC20 for a nice discount. And now back to the video. We're looking at a 4090 being considerably faster than the 4080 16GB. Now there's certainly a difference. That is also going to apply to the 4080 12GB, or now what most likely will become the 4070 Ti. You can see between these three RTX 4000 GPUs, there exists a pretty decent gap in performance. Now a 4070 Ti makes a lot more sense than a 4080 12GB. At least they're kind of dividing the GPUs up a little bit, but it's been kind of weird. Even AMD has done two 7900s. One is the XT, one is the XTX. I don't know why they don't want to name it something else. I think it's probably due to pricing. Imagine if AMD named it a 7900 XTX at $999. Everybody would be okay. The 7800 XT at $899, people would compare it to the $649 6800 XT, and they would say AMD just upped the price. So in a weird way, AMD kind of snuck one by us. Even though everybody's happy that it's $899 for a 7900 XT, should that have really have been a 6800 or a 7800 XT as sort of the history would justify? Remember, the 6800 XT wasn't really all that much slower than a 6900 XT, and it cost considerably less. AMD wants none of that. They want to have their cake and eat it too, give you a good price GPU, not changing the price at $999, while raising the price of sort of the less profitable, cheaper model, which should have been a 7800 XT, all the way up to a 7900 XT at $899. So it seems like they're giving us a better deal, but really they probably just raised the price of sort of the second in line GPU. I just want to point that out, that AMD also does these things with the GPU naming and pricing. It's not just Nvidia. They're all playing this game and trying to get one kind of bias, trying to get us to pay a little bit more for performance that used to cost less. Sometimes they'll kind of like bait us a little bit with sort of the high-end GPU being the one that you really want, like the XTX, while upping the price of the secondary GPU, which they'll likely still sell a lot of. So that certainly kind of explains the naming convention of having like one GPU model with various submodels. I'm not too sure what I think of that on initial launch. I'd rather just see one GPU like we saw a 3090, and I'm fine if they want to release a 3090 Ti, but like 6 months later or a year later. Don't do it sort of in the same release day, the same release cycle. That's the same thing with the 4080 that had two different models. It's just going to end up being confusing for people. It's like, are you buying an AMD 7900 XT or you mean the XTX? Sure, if we're following it here and you guys subscribe to the channel, you're going to know the difference. You're going to be really in tune. But what about the typical buyer? They may not really know what that difference is. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Now, this is going to bring us around after the naming scheme to the actual pricing of the 4070 Ti. So let's see a few facts to help us sort of narrow down the price. Nvidia priced the 4080 12GB initially at $899. We know that's not going to work. People hated that price, even for a 4080, even though it was cut down. Now, they price sort of the 3070 Ti, the MSRP for the Founders Edition is going to be $599. So we narrowed it down between $599 and $899. We know it's not going to be $899 because they would just be laughed out of existence compared to the 7900 XT. How about $799 down to $599? Well, would $599 really be reasonable? It looks like Nvidia has so far raised the price of every RTX 4000. Even the 4090 is $1599, which is a $100 increase over the 3090. Not to mention the 4080 16GB, which is $1199, which is a huge increase over the $699 3080. Now, I guess you could compare this 4080 to the 3080 12GB, which didn't really have an MSRP and it often retailed for $1,200 when it first came out, but it still went up in price from the original 3080, so the argument stands. So Nvidia has certainly raised the price of every single generation, so I don't really know if it's likely they would price it at $599. So that's going to leave us with either $699 or $799 for that 4080 12GB. Now, remember, there's not supposed to be a Founders Edition for this particular GPU. At least that was true for the 4080 12GB. Typically, the Founder Edition GPUs, which are made just by Nvidia, they're going to have the lowest base MSRP. Third-party AIB models, like something from Asus, they're generally going to tack on a few $100s or at least $100 over that price in order to sell the GPU as sort of a third-party custom model, for example. So now, given that there's going to be no Founders Edition for a 4070 Ti, at least that we know of right now, and Nvidia has been raising the price, $699 for a 4070 Ti seems kind of reasonable. If people compare it to a 3070 Ti, it's going to be about a $100 markup, but once again, it's going to be an AIB model, so I would expect it $699 to $799. I know that Nvidia are not going to touch $899 because that's going to be very embarrassing compared to the 7900 XT. So my best guess is $699 to $799. That's the price that we're going to see a 4070 Ti at 12GB. Now, since we know a little bit, very little about the performance, I mean, we've just seen some sort of preliminary graphs by Nvidia. What does that mean in terms of the pricing? I mean, okay, it's better than $899, but if you have other RTX 3000 GPUs still for sale, how does it compare to those? The advantages of a 4070 Ti, I mean, DLSS 3.0, if that really gets implemented better in certain games like Flight Simulator 2020 over time, that's going to be definitely a factor for people. If you play a game with DLSS 3.0, you may want to get an RTX 4000 because after all, these are going to be the only GPUs that will support DLSS 3.0. Even though RTX 3000 is technically capable of doing DLSS 3.0, Nvidia so far has not released it for those GPUs because they said the experience wouldn't be quite the same. You just need the upgraded hardware in RTX 4000. So that's one point for the 4070 Ti. Now, what type of cooler is it going to use? Is it going to be a really big cooler like we've been used to with these, weird power connectors? That remains to be seen. If this GPU $699 to $799. How's it looking against the rest of the field in terms of the RTX 3000? I mean, for in that $700 range and below, I think it's probably a no-brainer to go with that GPU. That's probably why Nvidia is sort of holding off on releasing it, because it's definitely going to blow a lot of the RTX 3000 GPUs out of the water depending on the pricing. Now, even though this wasn't a good 4080, as a well-priced 4070 Ti, I can certainly start to see the argument here, and I think it's going to sell pretty well because all the other GPUs certainly have been selling, and even though it's not a 4080 anymore, at a lower price than at $899, it's certainly going to be a more attractive performance value. Then I guess you'll have questions of used GPUs on the market that are quickly coming down in price and still very high performance. But in terms of new GPUs, if a 3090 Ti performance is fairly close to this, and this one is going to be a little cheaper, I think a lot of people will like to go for the newer GPU, no doubt about it. So the 4070 Ti, as we can see, it definitely has a little bit of a space there. Remember, there are no new 4000 series GPUs anywhere under $1,000. The 4080 12GB was the only hope at $899, even if it wasn't that great. So this one coming in at $699 or $799, even though it's still probably a little bit too expensive, people would rather pay $599. That seems a lot more fair. It's still going to be something that's going to sell a lot because there's nothing else to compete with it in terms of new GPUs. Even AMD's 7900 XT is going to be starting at that $899 limit. And there's something else to be said about that. That's going to be their reference edition. Now, you can expect the third-party AIBs, which will be a lot more numerous in the market, things like from Power Color, maybe even Asus, those are definitely going to have a premium over that price. So a 7900 XT could probably end up being over $1,000 very, very easily when it comes to the third-party AIB models, which, like I said, are going to be more numerous on the market. So that's kind of my view on Nvidia rebranding this 4070 Ti. Let me know what you guys think down below. If you think it's actually going to be a very popular GPU, if it's the next one to come out after the 4080 16GB and at a much cheaper price point, I think it could actually do fairly decently. People are waiting for a GPU well under $1,000. All right, guys, remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.